Welcome to History of Japan. This is week 2. I love this cartoon. Been there, done that with two Buddhist priests sitting next to one another on a park bench looking at the birds tearing up a piece of bread. And we'll talk a little bit about the transmigration of souls and the cyclical view of Asian history in this lecture piece. So, the important thing to know, why do we want to study Asia? Why do we want to study Japan in the first place? Well, there's a practical importance of all of us as Americans becoming knowledgeable about Asia. And it is very now clear in terms of GDP, gross domestic product, what the ranking of the world is. China now has the largest economy. Now you have to remember China has well over 1 billion people, and the United States has 300 and some million people. So, China is over 3 times the size in population. So, while the United States GDP per person is still greater, China is now the world's largest economy, followed by that of the European Union. And then the United States, and look at here, India and Japan. So, of the top 5 economies in the world, 3 of them are in Asia, and of course number 5 is Japan. What we want to talk a little bit is about the religious and philosophical differences between the East and the West. And a lot of these are rooted in different religions and philosophies. Buddhism, Confucianism, Taoism, and Shintoism all give to Eastern thought a cyclical framework. There's not the belief in an individual soul, but in all of us participating in the entire soul of the universe. And so there's such a thing as the belief in the transmigration of souls, what is sometimes referred to as reincarnation. The idea that after one dies, that one may pass into a different life form, and that life form may or may not be due to individual decisions that you make in this life. Now, in contrast, Western religions like Judaism, Christianity, and Islam are more teleological. Teleology is the study of final causes. And so, if you look at Judaism, the belief was always that they were a chosen people and there would be a Messiah. Hence, in the future, things would be better than they are in the past, in the present. And Judaism, as part of its religion, said you need to understand that we're a chosen people. We need to understand the history of how that came about, the history of how we were in Egypt and the exodus out of Egypt, etc. So Judaism had a very distinct understanding of past, present, and future. That also played off into Christianity, which literally grew out of Judaism in the Middle East. And Christianity also had that sense of past, present, and future, all being rather distinct, and all getting better and moving towards, in that instance, the second coming of Christ and the end of the world and, paradise. Islam, etc. All of these religions are more teleological, and because they were such a vital part of the societies of which they played a role, they certainly were influential in the larger cultural ways of thinking. Now, when we say that Buddhism, Confucianism, Taoism, and Shintoism gave to the Asian societies a more cyclical view of history, that essentially means that there was also early on in some of these religions as well the belief that things sort of repeated themselves. And there wasn't such a great distinction between what was past, what was present, and what was future. Another very important thing to remember about the difference between Western thought and Eastern or Asian thought is Eastern thought sees a greater wholeness or unity of nature and of humankind. That is, of a harmony. it does not view the world so much as Judaism, Christianity, and Islam do, through the perspective of this dichotomy between good and evil. And instead, there's this more harmonious sense of the universe. Now, each of these things are building upon one another. So when we next talk about a third kind of topic of Asian societies, and we've brought this point up before, we say that they have more collective societies where group consensus and decision-making take precedence over individualism. So in Asia and Japan, there's more of a stress on the group and the group's needs rather than the individual's needs. And part of this comes out of this whole sense of a natural harmony, a harmony of the universe, a harmony of nature, a harmony of humankind, and that always the important thing is that harmony be sustained at all times. Now I'm going to give you an example of this group consensus. For many years, I was at Thomas More College for 10 years, Director of International Studies, which meant not only the International Studies degree, but also all of our sister school relationships, all of our study abroad opportunities, etc. And for years and years, we had students come for 10 years to a summer English as a second language program at Thomas More College. And when I was, at first of all, young and naive, I knew that we'd have to have classes for these students, but I also knew that our Japanese sister school wanted to learn something about American culture. So they wanted to be able to visit museums and state parks and national parks. They wanted to ride horses. They wanted to go see art. They wanted to see the Air Force Museum in Dayton, Ohio. They wanted to do all of the things, play tennis and go swimming and go to Kings Island amusement park, etc. And so I wanted to give them their choice of what they wanted to do. And I found out, I said here, I gave them all different brochures, and I said, now what would you like to do while you're here? And then I said, you can vote on it. And they just kind of looked at me as I explained the different places, and they said, could we please take this back to our dormitory rooms, and tonight we will do homework about this. We will read about these places, and we will make our decisions, and we will let you know the next day. Well, unlike an American class that would have just kind of decided by, roll call vote, just who wants to go to the amusement park, and nearly everybody would stick up their hands, and there'd be a couple of people who would not want to go to the amusement park. And then maybe we would say an art museum, and maybe not so many Americans would want to go to an art museum, and so the majority would always rule. In this case, they made it very clear to me that all of them would get to do something that they wanted to do. So even a minority of them wanted to go to an art museum, and a majority of them wanted to go to Kings Island to an amusement park. They worked it all out in consensus, in compromise among themselves, because they wanted each and every student participating in that program to have a good experience and all of them to get along harmoniously. Now, when you are living in a society that believes in harmony, in collective societies, and group consciousness, tied to this sense of group consciousness is a mentality of duties and responsibilities, of polite and proper behavior, of honor and dishonor in the face of the group. An example of Japanese and Chinese names: the surname usually comes first. Then the personal name, the given name, comes next. So I would be Tenkari Paul. Now, if I would introduce myself, I would say in Japanese, Watashi wa Tenkari-san, now actually Watashi wa, and then it's Northern Kentucky Daigaku, and then I would say I'm a history professor, and then I would say that I'm Tenkari Paul. even the sentence structure of introducing oneself would come across as, I am Northern Kentucky University History Department Professor Tenkate Paul, which means that the most important thing to me would be my place of work in that instance, Northern Kentucky University. And the second most important thing would be the fact that I'm a member of the history department. And the third most important thing would be I'm a professor. And the fourth most important thing would be that I'm a member of the Tenkate family. And the least important thing would be that I am Paul. I am an individual. Even when we had professors come over for a faculty exchange, one of them, his name was Professor Yamamoto, was the last name. And his first name was Kenji. And I began to, after he was here for a while, say, well, would it be okay if I called you by your first name, Kenji? And he says, oh my, no. When you're in kindergarten, you might call somebody by their first name. But we're grown-ups, we're adults, we need to maintain this sense of propriety, of honor, and so forth. And so I will continue to call you Dr. Tenkate, and you can call me Yamamoto Sensei. Now, all of this unity of nature and this group consciousness lead to a greater deal of flexibility. And that is because the Japanese do not want to offend anyone. And they don't want to close the door on anything permanently. So sometimes they'll say yes or maybe when they really mean no. Now, Westerners often misinterpret this as being evasive or deceitful, or even as an example of what they call the so-called inscrutable Eastern mind or Asian mind. But again, this is all part of the harmony, the collective, the group consciousness, the sense of being polite, of not offending someone, of not definitely saying no, because that can be a really offensive thing sometimes to people. There's also a difference in the languages. The languages of Asia tend to be made up of ideograms, that is, picture words, and in Japanese there are 1,850 commonly used ideograms. In Chinese there are about 50,000 of those. This means that their educational systems are tilted more towards memorization. So let's talk a little bit about how Asian languages kind of develop through ideograms. And I give you this an example. In ancient China, the sun looked like this, which looks like a sun. So that's the way they wrote it. And then they found it took too long to do all this, so they left off the rays and just did this. And then if you're using a brush, right, an ink and brush, which is what they did in those days, they didn't have pencils and ballpoint pens, then they found that this could be too difficult. It's very difficult to make a circle with a brush. So they squared it off, and this became the sun. But it also could mean a number of other things as well. Now, this was the character in ancient Chinese for tree. And it was gradually simplified to this, and to this, and to this. And then if that's a tree, then look at this. This is the roots of a tree. So now we have this meaning root, and it's pronounced hon. The compound form by putting the root together with the sun is Nippon or Nihon, which is what the Japanese call their country, literally the origin of the sun, and that's because of the sun myth that we're going to tell you about in a few minutes. Now, it's important to realize that the Japanese had their own language, the Chinese had their own language, but the Chinese developed the written characters. And the Japanese borrowed those characters at one point in time, as we'll tell you about this. So they're still, and even though there are vast differences between Japanese and Chinese in the characters and the number of characters, you know, in a pinch, a Chinese and a Japanese person could use some basic characters and understand one another in the writing, not in the speaking. So the Japanese language is considered an Altaic language group, strangely enough, along with Korean, Mongolian, and Finnish. So it's just like this whole group of people, you know, moved across Northern Asia and Europe. In the 400 CE, that is the Christian era, or AD, the Japanese borrowed Chinese written symbols but applied it to their own Japanese words. So Japanese language currently uses about 2,000 Chinese characters, or kanji. It also utilizes a phonetic system called kana, and there are 104 hiragana and 104 katakana. Japanese give their surnames, their family names first, and their personal given names next. In this class, we will reverse this to Western order. That is, the personal name first, the surname last. I will always attempt to bold Japanese surnames for you. I will also Westernize the names for you in the Roman alphabet, or what is called Romaji. Now, the pronunciation of Japanese is fairly easy because usually it's kind of consonant, vowel, consonant, vowel. So let's just practice some of the most common Japanese surnames. These are the most common family names in Japan. Coming in at number 1, Sato. Sato. And it's got that long mark over it, so you hold it a little longer. Suzuki. Takahashi. Tanaka. I'm doing these very slowly to show you pronunciation. Watanabe. Watanabe. Ito. Yamamoto. Yamamoto. Nakamura. Nakamura. Kobayashi. Saito. Kato. Yoshida. Yamada. Sasaki. Yamaguchi. Matsumoto. So now let's go a little bit into some geography and see where we're at in the world. Okay, so here we are. This is the Middle East. That's Turkey. This is Europe. You see the boot of Italy. This is Russia, and you see all these former Russian republics. This is China, India, Southeast Asia, and whoop, Korea. And then you see just east of Korea, Japan. Some basic information. Notice how we've taken this map of Japan and superimposed it on a map of the United States, just to kind of show you the difference. You know, the Japanese islands could literally fit along the East Coast, but they would go all the way from about Montreal in terms of the latitude all the way down here to northern Florida. So the latitude is shown here where they would lie in relation to cities in the United States. So, you know, Yokohama and Tokyo and Kyoto and Nagoya, all some of the principal cities, would be right in the latitude of North Carolina down here. So, some basic information. Japan has 128 million people. The total land area is the size of California. It has few mineral resources in short, swift-running rivers that are not amenable to navigation. It consists of 4 major islands. Honshu, which is the largest and most populous island, that is this one. And then to the north, Hokkaido. Shikoku, which is down here and separated from Honshu by the inland sea. And Kyushu, which is the island right here. And of course, there are additional islands as well, the Ryukyu Islands, etc., and we'll talk about them more as time goes on. So you can see that the Pacific Ocean is all along here on both sides of Japan. We refer to this part of the Pacific between Korea and Japan as the Sea of Japan. So, you know, seas are kind of just smaller places, reference points for oceans. We've already shown you the inland sea. We're going to be talking about the Pacific Ring of Fire here in a minute, which means that Japan experiences lots of earthquakes and some volcanoes. And then we're also going to tell you that Japan is so mountainous that less than 1/5 of it, so less than 20% of it, is level enough to permit agriculture or other kinds of economic exploitation. Only about 15% of Japan's landmass is under cultivation. In mineral resources, Japan is very poorly endowed. Japan is short of almost every important mineral resource. And that's something to remember because it's always made Japan and the Japanese feel like they were very vulnerable to others because they are very dependent upon other places for basic mineral resources like oil and coal, etc., iron ore. And so their trade becomes very important to them so that they can take those raw materials and turn them into something to trade so that they can afford to buy raw materials. And there are a couple of different plains, that is, not mountainous, not hilly areas, but plain areas. And this map shows you those. One is the Kanto Plain near Tokyo. Another is the Nobi Plain near the city of Nagoya. And a third is the Osaka Plain near the cities of Osaka, Kobe, Kyoto, and Nara. Now, the reason why I mention this to you is in most civilizations, cities generally don't grow up on mountaintops and hillsides, but they usually grow up in fertile plains. And so these very fertile plains give rise, the three of them, to the largest cities in Japan: Tokyo, Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe, Kyoto, and Nara. The science of plate tectonics is fairly new. It really only began to develop in the 1960s. And what we know about that is that the Earth is divided into a dozen or so lithospheric plates, which are constantly moving. Now, there literally are radioactive elements in the interior of the Earth, the core and mantle of the Earth, that are continually breaking down, literally causing atomic energy, causing heat and convection currents that literally move the plates above. Some of these plates are converging, that is, they're coming together. Some of the plates are diverging, that is, they are moving apart. And some are sliding past one another in what are called transform faults. We know, for instance, that in California, you've got, at the San Andreas Fault out here in California, you've got a transform fault where one of the plates, the North American plate, and then the Pacific plate, are literally sliding past one another. And we know that occasionally the things kind of get hooked up, so to speak, and a lot of energy is produced and earthquakes can result. In the case of Japan, 3 to 4 plates are colliding. Some people call the Amurian and Sea of Okhotsk plate as a single Eurasian plate. So it depends upon your outlook. But we know that the Pacific, the Eurasian, and the Philippines plates are all colliding, and that those collisions formed the Japanese islands. So you see the Eurasian plate is moving this way, the Philippine Sea plate is moving this way, and in between all of that, the Pacific plate is then moving this way, and all of this is causing tectonic activity in the Japanese islands, and indeed all around this area, which we call the Pacific Ring of Fire. Ring of Fire because there are active volcanoes and earthquakes and underwater, which comes to form giant waves or tsunami. To the east of Japan is a deep ocean plate where the heavier Pacific plate is being thrust underneath, subducted under the Eurasian plate. Japan has dozens of active volcanoes and many more that are dormant. There are countless geysers and hot springs, and up to 1,000 earthquakes are experienced each year. Obviously, most of those are very small. This is then the Pacific Ring of Fire, showing you volcanoes and earthquake epicenters. This is showing you the different plates that are coming together and not only form the Japanese islands, but are indeed responsible for tectonic activity there. And this is showing that sea trench, which is the result of the Pacific plate thrusting under the Eurasian plate over here. And when those earthquakes occur, you sometimes get tidal waves caused by them, as occurred in the March 2011 earthquake off of the Pacific coast of Tohoku, an undersea earthquake of magnitude 9.0 that caused nearly 16,000 deaths in Japan from the resultant tsunami. Now that's a 9.0. Charles Richter was the person who came up with this logarithmic scale to measure earthquakes, and each increase of 1 on the scale represents an earthquake 10 times in magnitude. So around here in the Cincinnati area, the Ohio River Valley, we've had in recent decades some 5.1s, 5.2, 5.3, thereabout, moderate earthquakes. Please know that a 6.0 earthquake would be 10 times. So if you've ever experienced a 5 or 6-point earthquake, a 5-point earthquake, know that a 6-point earthquake would be 10 times what a 5.0 is. A 7.0 earthquake would be 10 times what a 6.0 is, or 100 times what a 5.0 is. An 8-point would be 10 times the 7.0, which in turn would be a 10 times this and 10 times that. So this, a 7.0, is 10 times, 100 times bigger than a 5.0, and so on and so forth. So you can see that a 9.0 is huge. The tsunami then are tidal waves sometimes formed by earthquakes below the ocean. They can be destructive, such as in the 9.0 March 2011 earthquake and tsunami off the Pacific coast at Tohoku in Japan. Now, to understand a little bit more about Japan, because geography affects a civilization and its history, I'm going to tell you a little bit about some of Dr. Tenkati's weather commandments. Number 1, land areas heat up and cool down more rapidly than water. Conversely, water heats up and cools down more slowly than land. Thus, water has a tempering effect on climate. Just think of when you're hot in the summer, where do you go? You go to the beach. The water is cooler than the surrounding air above the land. Think of where you go. You go to a pool. Hey, you start opening up a pool about Memorial Day, right, in May, and you first go to that pool and woo, it's so cold. The water is so cold because it takes a long time for the water to begin to heat up. Now, number 2, hot air rises and experiences a drop in atmospheric pressure. Cold air falls and experiences a rise in atmospheric pressure. I have a photo of a hot air balloon. Why is it hot air? Because hot air rises and experiences a drop in atmospheric pressure. Nobody ever talks about a cold air balloon, right? It's no such thing. Now, air seeks equilibrium. It goes from high pressure areas into low pressure areas. And how does it do that? It does that in respect to wind. Wind direction is always given by the direction from which the winds come. For example, in the Cincinnati and Northern Kentucky, Ohio River Valley area, winds generally come from the west, so we usually say that this area of the Ohio Valley is affected by westerlies. So this just shows you the principle. Okay, cold air falls, cool air falls, it's a higher pressure. Warm air rises, it's a lower pressure. Wind goes from a high pressure area to a low pressure area. Now, one more thing we have to say. Condensation is when a gas turns into a liquid. So air contains water vapor. When air is cooled, it loses its ability to retain moisture, reaches its saturation point, and condensation begins. Condensation marks the change from a gas to a liquid. Relative humidity is the amount of water vapor in the air relative to the maximum amount of water vapor that could exist at that temperature. Therefore, relative humidity is only useful, meaningful in terms of the air temperature. So, what contains more moisture? 90% humidity at 90 degrees Fahrenheit or 90% humidity at 35 degrees Fahrenheit? The answer is 90% humidity at 90 degrees Fahrenheit. So, remember what we say. In the summer, boy, it's a hot, humid day. When do you ever say in the midst of winter, boy, it's a cold, humid day? No, cold air cannot hold as much moisture. Warm air can hold a lot more moisture. All right, so what happens on a hot day when, in this video clip from Family Guy, this lady is telling him about what happens. You've got a cool glass of water. It's a hot day, and all of a sudden the air, the hot humid air, is hitting the cool glass. And when it hits the cool glass, the air cools down right away. And when it cools down, it can't hold its moisture and it starts to condense. So you get water droplets on the outside. I sort of like Family Guy. And so let's go watch this episode of Family Guy.
Previously on condensation.
Ellen, there's moisture on the outside of my glass.
It's condensation, Johnny.
But what about the fog on the windows?
It's not fog, Johnny. It too is called condensation.
Condensation.
Anyhow, occasionally they'll do this stupid stuff on Family Guy. So let's go back to that, and let's put all of this together and make... And condensation is also dew. You've heard of dew in the morning. And now we're going to put all this together, and we are going to understand once and for all what is happening in Asia when we talk about monsoons. And the most important thing for you to understand is a monsoon is a distinct wet and dry season. That's all it means. It means that some portions of the year are very wet, get a lot of precipitation, and some are very dry. And by the way, the Ohio River Valley is not a monsoon climate. We get precipitation year-round. And you might say, but Dr. Tankati, we get more rain in spring than we do. Notice I didn't say that we don't. I said we get precipitation all year round, although it might be a little more than at other times. A monsoon has distinct wet and dry seasons, and it's caused by the size of the Eurasian continent. Look how big. It's the largest continent in landmass, and it's caused by differing air pressures. Japan experiences hot and humid southeastern monsoons in summer and cold and dry northwestern monsoons in winter, which they pick up some moisture from the Sea of Japan and drop snow on the windward side of mountains in Japan. What happens is when the air masses from Siberia and the Pacific alternate, a front hangs over Japan, bringing rain to the southwest, the plum rains in June and July, and to the northeast in September and October. It also will bring hurricanes, sorry for the misspelling, in late summer or October. And this shows you the difference. This is January in the Asian continent, and it's cooling down very quickly. The land is cooling down more quickly than the ocean surrounding. The air falls. As it falls, it forms a high-pressure system over Asia, and the air over the water of the Pacific and Indian Oceans is cooling down much more slowly. So there's a low-pressure system. Winds go from a high pressure to a low pressure system, And when they start sweeping over, those winds start sweeping over the Pacific, Sea of Japan, etc., they start picking up moisture and causing rain. The opposite happens in July, when the Asian air mass heats up much quicker than the water, so there's a low pressure system over Asia and a high pressure system over the water. Air winds go from high pressure to low pressure. As they move across the ocean, they'll pick up some rain and cause rain. So this is responsible for the different seasons. Japan is divided mainly between two climates, humid continental and humid subtropical. Interesting point, did you know that the Cincinnati, Northern Kentucky area is a transition zone between humid continental and humid subtropical? So you already know these climates. Now, rain is very important for agriculture. It was very important for rice because rice has to be grown in rice paddies, which have to be flooded with water. And you have to sometimes bring water in by irrigation canals into those fields. Notice that they make use of every available space in Japan to grow rice and other crops because there is so little land available for cultivation. So you see these coming right up against factories and warehouses. From earliest times, as we see in this museum, this is what the rice looks like. It has to be, of course, separated into its separate kernels. You see the cutout of a lady taking this and with a mortar and pestle pounding these things out. Later on, you would use a water wheel to do kind of the same thing, to trip hammers and to separate the rice out. This is the growing of green tea. And what they'll do is they'll take when these get large enough, they'll take the outer layers of these and they'll take the tea leaves off and make green tea, which is very popular in Japan. These are soybeans. We're going to be talking about, the importance of soy. If you go to a Japanese restaurant, soy sauce and tofu and all of that. Bamboo, which is very quick growing and is used for all kinds of things, like you saw in the prior thing. Fences, it is used in some places in Asia for scaffolding, etc. And then you see the lotus flowers. This is actually a lake. And see the water in the lake? And these lotus flowers grow up from the very bottom of the lake and pop up over into the surface. So I said that Japan is very hilly, 70% mountainous or hilly terrain. This shows you some of this. It also shows you these are hot springs. So we're looking at a little bit of the tectonic activity of the Pacific Ring of Fire. So now that all is going to be very important because we've talked a little bit about the lack of resources, the mountainous areas, the climate, when the rains come, how that is useful, etc. for agriculture. So we have to talk literally just a few minutes here about the Paleolithic or Old Stone Age in Japan. Human habitation in Japan dates back over 30,000 years. At least those are the earliest human fossils. But it may go back as many as 200,000 years. The Paleolithic, or the Old Stone Age, was a period of hunting and gathering, and the people traded in obsidian, which is a volcanic glass which can be used for all kinds of tools, for knives and spears and the like. The last ice age reached its height about 18,000 years ago and ended about 10,000 years ago. And there were at least 3 land bridges to the Asian mainland over which people may have come into Japan. So when there was the Ice Age, a lot of the water in the oceans was taken up by ice on land and glaciers. And so that meant that the ocean levels were much lower than they are, which meant that land bridges appeared. And you see 3 of these land bridges that may have been used for people coming over and traveling back and forth between the mainland of Asia, and Japan. Now, we're going to move in rather quickly through prehistoric Japan because we obviously want to get to the point where we come to historic Japan and we know more about it. We just simply don't know as much about prehistoric Japan as we would like to. After the Old Stone Age was the Mesolithic, or the Middle Stone Age, and the Neolithic, or the New Stone Age. And we're going to talk there about the Jomon culture of about 13,000 BCE, before the Christian era, to about 300 BCE, otherwise known as BC, before Christ. Mesolithic culture is usually associated with a transition culture between Paleolithic and Neolithic, where the people were still engaged in hunting and gathering, but they also started some basic agriculture. And because they started basic agriculture, basic settling down in villages. Where the Neolithic is associated, most definitely, with agriculture, settling down, villages, and the domestication of animals. Many early cultures around the world made rope pattern pottery. That is, they made pottery out of clay, and then they took ropes and they put them around the pottery and kind of, went back and forth on it so that it would make pretty little marks on the pottery. This is not unique to Japan, but is seen all over the world. The word jomon means cord marked. So it's rope pattern or cord marked pottery. And so the pottery of the era, the jomon, the rope pattern, gives its name to the culture. Obviously, we have no idea what the people called themselves. They may not have even had a name for their culture. They did not have a potter's wheel. This is humankind's earliest kind of pottery. And they also lived in pit dwellings, which we're going to show you a picture of here in a minute. Archaeological sites for this Jomon period have been found from the north of Japan to the island of Hokkaido, all the way to the south to the Ryukyu Islands. They also had these little clay figurines that you see here. Don't know what they were used for. In many early cultures around the world, these sorts of things were used in fertility cults. Perhaps that was the situation. They also fished, and they practiced perhaps some slash and burn agriculture. Now, slash and burn agriculture is a really early part of agriculture, and what it essentially does is it just means you go in, you slash down all the vegetation, you burn it, and then you proceed, because things are very fertile at that point, to cultivate plants. Rice was introduced about 3,000 years ago, and the Ainu of Japan, who are kind of this, they currently live mainly in the island of Hokkaido, and they're rather tall and slender and kind of different in physiological appearance than many of the Japanese, are probably descendants of the Jomon culture. Now, the Neolithic Stone Age, we're going to associate that with the Yayoi culture, which lasted about 600 years from 300 BCE to 300 CE, that is AD. It's associated with agriculture, domesticated animals, and settled villages. And the Yayoi culture is named after a suburb of Tokyo where pottery was discovered back in 1884. And this pottery was different because it was thrown on wheels, so they had pottery wheels. The culture seemed to start in Kyushu and then extend northward. Perhaps they invaded. Immigrants arrived in numbers from the continent, immigrants that seemed to be different in appearance and culture from the Jomon people. They were lighter and taller with narrower faces. We don't know where they came from. Some people say Korea. One theory is that they may have been one of the tribes displaced by the building of the Great Wall in China. We don't know. They lived in pit dwellings and raised dwellings. They had rice paddies, irrigation. They used iron and bronze, such as you'll see here. And they made beautiful swords and bells like you see here in this bronze bell. So this is a period of iron and bronze. And this shows you the Yayoi culture, and it shows you some of the raised buildings, which usually were used to store grain and the like. And you would store grain and rice and the like to keep it up and away from rats and other, animals. You see here a pit dwelling. This is a reconstruction of a pit dwelling. Notice that it's actually built down into a pit. So here you go and see there's the land, and then this is the pit dwelling. This is inside the pit dwelling, and you can see where the roof begins. Here would be where, if you had a central fire, where the smoke would be emitted out each side. So you can imagine how smoky the interiors would be. Why, do you say, did they live in pit dwellings? Why did they dig them down a little bit? Well, probably because it made them a little cooler in summer that way and a little warmer in winter. That's just a guess. Well, the next culture we're going to look at from 300 to 600 AD is the so-called Kofun or tomb culture. Possibly invaders coming from Korea who were riding horses, using iron swords and wearing armor may have been responsible for this culture. They moved from Kyushu northward, and they left for us, and archaeologists have found earthen mounds of tombs, sometimes with stone burial chambers and buried objects like swords, mirrors, and jewelry. They also surrounded their tombs with little haniwa, that is, hollow clay figures of about 2 to 3 feet high. Some of these haniwa are of animals, like this one is, a horse, and others of human beings. We don't know their real purpose. Perhaps they were used to mark the tombs. Perhaps they were status symbols. Perhaps they were to protect the dead. Perhaps they were to help keep the tombs from eroding. Those are all different theories. Well, that is prehistoric Japan. Now we can enter into historic Japan and its mythology. We get a lot of what we know about historic Japan from the Kojiki. That is the record of ancient matters, which dates from about 712 AD. And we also get it from the Nihon Shoki, the Chronicle of Japan, which dates from about 720 AD. So they're both from the 700s. These chronicles first mention the myth of Japan's creation, which probably offered legitimacy to its ruling family, who claimed descent from the sun goddess. Again, these myths were meant to give a kind of spiritual or religious legitimacy. And the creation myth of Japan deals with the divine brother-sister team of Izanami and Izanagi. And Izanami, she was the female. She died giving birth to the fire god. Well, imagine giving birth to the fire god. That probably would kill you. Izanagi, he was the male. So they're brother and sister, and he went down to the underworld, Yomi, to find Izanami. And in the underworld, Izanagi found that the smell was so wretched, so he purified himself in a stream. This is going to be very important to Shintoism, where people are purifying themselves with water. And as he purified himself, new deities came to light out of his clothes, his nose, his eyes. Mainly Amaterasu, the sun goddess, whose most sacred shrine is at Ise, and Susanoo, the storm god, which came out of his nose. And that's the second most sacred Shinto shrine in Japan, and that's at Izumo, which is on the west coast of Honshu, and then also the moon god. Now, Amaterasu, the sun goddess, and Susanoo, the storm god, were then children of Izanagi. They came out of his body parts. And they were not only children, which meant that they were brother and sister, but they were also husband and wife, or spouses. Now, what we know about their relationship as husband and wife is that the storm god had a stormy personality, and he treated the sun god very poorly. He trampled on her rice fields. He defecated in her palace. He even threw a pony through her roof. And the sun goddess got so mad that she decided to withdraw into a cave at Ise. And when she withdrew into the cave, it took away sun and light and rays from the world. And the other gods and goddesses held a party. They tried to get her to come out of the cave. And they put at the entrance to the cave a mirror. And they were dancing and having fun and drinking and eating. And, you know, the mirror, she could see that they were all out having fun. And she was inside and she wasn't having fun. And so they got her to come out of the cave. But the storm god was punished for his bad behavior, and supposedly he was banished to the area of Izumo, and his descendants fought with the descendants of the sun goddess. Here we have probably the kernel of truth in this myth, that there is one family that is saying it is descended from the storm god living one place, another family, the sun goddess, they fight one another, and the sun goddess's family, hate to give away the plot, is going to win here and still is the dynasty that rules Japan today. Ninigi, a grandson of the sun goddess, was sent to Earth. He settled in northern Kyushu and brought with him the 3 sacred imperial symbols of Japan. The mirror, the sword. The mirror was the symbol of the sun goddess, of Amaterasu. The sword, a symbol of the storm god, lightning, and a curved jewel, which was the moon god. Then, in so-called about 660 to 582 BCE, Jimmu Tenno was the heavenly emperor who may have been mythical. He was Ninigi's grandson, fought wars and came into the area of present-day Osaka, settled in the area, and known as Yamato Great Peace, and became the legendary emperor and founder of the imperial line, defeating the sun god rulers at Izumo. So Jimmu Tenno is the heavenly emperor. May or may not have been, real, maybe mythical, maybe not. But he's the person or the representation of the person who brings the dynastic line of the sun goddess to power over Japan. Today, at certain Shinto shrines, you can see this, the wedded rocks representing Izanagi and Izanami. And Amaterasu is, of course, the sun goddess shown here, etc. Ise Shrine at Amaterasu, which is rebuilt every 20 years. This is the sacred shrine of the sun goddess of Japan. So, let's go to the Yamato period from 400 to 710 AD. And again, our information really comes from that Kojiki, that record of ancient matters, and the Nihon Shoki, the Chronicle of Japan. And interestingly enough, the creation story, which seems to legitimize the imperial line, claiming descent from the sun goddess, and its rival line over at Izumo. In 1984, archaeologists discovered near Izumo 385 bronze swords some 2,000 years ago. So whether it was one big battle or whether it was a process of intimidation and negotiations and small battles, we don't know. From Korea during the Yamato period, scholars brought the Chinese characters. So Yamato again means great peace. Yamato, Azuma, Chinese characters. And of the emperors, we can say, as one historian has said, that they reigned but did not rule. This is going to be true of a lot of imperial history in Japan. Instead, the Uji, or the clans, ruled. We also see here during the Yamato period the Shinto religion, which included beliefs in animism. Animism is the belief that rivers, trees, rocks, etc. all had spirits, all had kamis, or spirits. And this is also the period where we talk about ritual cleansing, like given in the creation myth of Japan. So this shows you a Shinto shrine. And so we talked a little bit now just about Shintoism, which is one of the native religions of China. Sometimes you'll go to these shrines and you'll see these amap, these prayer cards. And you also see omikuji. These are omikuji. And they usually have on the other side of them the junishi, the 12 animal signs. You know, the Chinese astrological signs, like, you know, were you born in the year of the monkey? Were you born in the year of the horse, the ox, the snake, the rabbit, the rat, etc.? And then you'll get these fortunes in, you know, here, and you have prayer cards where you can put your prayers and write them on the opposite side of these. These are the fortunes that you can buy at some of these Shinto shrines. Well, also in the Yamato period, Buddhism came to Japan right around 550 AD from Korea. Now, the one thing you need to know about Buddhism, and this is, I think, you know, very basically very important. Eastern philosophy is monistic versus Western philosophy, which is dualistic. What we're saying here is that Eastern philosophy believes in a harmony of nature and the universe and all that stuff, where Western philosophy tends to divide things in categories like good and evil. The founder of Buddhism was from India. His name was Siddhartha Gautama. He, at one point in time, sat under a Bodhi tree and found the middle way. That is the way of harmony, right? It's a way of harmony between two different ways of life. And he comes up with the Four Noble Truths, which is all life is inevitably full of sorrow and suffering, which, again, Western religions and so forth would say, but Western religions would also possibly say, number two, that the sorrow and suffering are caused by our desires. Probably in Western religions we would say, and also by certain evil forces, perhaps. Sorrow and suffering can only be stopped by controlling our desires. And, you know, that's kind of similar to Western philosophy of, like, you know, you're going to have temptations and the like, and you need to try to control those, and self-discipline, etc. And so all of this might all seem a little similar at first to Western religions, except that it stops at the point in time of what happens after death. And this is kind of where Siddhartha Gautama would differ here. In Siddhartha Gautama recognized, and Buddhism recognized, that the world is in a constant state of flux or change. And a lot of our unhappiness is directly related to our craving for permanence, our inability to accept the transience of life. And so he said, you could obtain nirvana. It could be achieved from any level of your life. And two kinds of Buddhism arose. One was a Theravada Buddhism, which believed that to achieve nirvana, you had to leave the world behind and enter a monastery. Mahayana Buddhism believed that you can live in this world and still achieve nirvana if you live a good moral life. And it introduced the concept of the bodhisattva, a deceased human being who could attain nirvana if he chose or she chose to do so, but out of compassion has volunteered to help others attain nirvana. And nirvana is the important concept here, and it is N-I-R-V-A-N-A. I forgot to put it on the hand. Sorry. N-I-R-V-A-N-A. And nirvana means it's what you have left. The analogy is this. If you have a candle, and the candle's your life, right? And you blow the candle out, nirvana is what you have after the candle is blown out. It becomes a part of the air around you. It becomes a part of the whole universe. That is, your life passes in now to the universe and all of the universe, which essentially is harmonious. This is the basic difference between Buddhism and, say, Christianity. Christianity says you have an individual soul. You're never really going to attain anything like happiness until you die and you go to heaven. Buddhism basically says, happiness really is possible here. You just need to learn to control your desires, and you can attain nirvana. And when you do die, it's going to be you become a part of the whole of the universe. Okay, see the distinct difference between those. It's represented, Buddhism, by a number of different beautiful temples in Japan, like the Todaiji Temple in Nara, which was built in the 700s AD. It had a great big fire, and it was rebuilt in 1692. So, according to the Nihon Shoki, which we talked about, the Korean state of Pikoche sent Buddhist scriptures and an image to Japan. And the Soga family of Korea, who lived in Japan, they were of Korean descent, they lived in Japan, were up-and-coming Japanese leaders, and they were the ones, the Soga family were the ones to adopt Buddhism. But they adopted Buddhism, and then an epidemic broke out, and the Japanese people blamed the Buddhist image for the epidemic, and they destroyed the image. So the Soga family received more Buddhist images and built a second Buddhist temple, and lo and behold, another epidemic occurred and the temple was destroyed, but it didn't stop them. They were allowed to adopt Buddhism, and one of the members of the Soga family, Prince Shotoku, became a regent to an empress and an important imperial official. He perhaps issued the 17-article constitution that promoted Confucianism, and Confucianism also had, it was from China, and it emphasized Wa, it emphasized harmony, Buddhism, and an imperial government based on the Japanese kind of government. This is big. Buddhism is important to Japan, was important historically. Confucianism from China was also important, and its emphasis on harmony, on Wa. And they not only took, as we said earlier, the Japanese borrowed the Chinese characters, they also borrowed the Chinese way of government. It was based on the Chinese system. So Shotoku lived in Nara and built a temple there. And that temple was called, so he lived in Nara, and the temple which you see over here is Horyuji Temple. And it's probably the oldest wooden building in the world. Okay. In 645 AD, the Fujiwara clan took control of the imperial crown in China in a coup d'etat, in a takeover. And they and the emperor brought about the Taika, literally meaning great change reforms, which centralized the bureaucracy with departments, which nationalized all of the land of Japan. So all the land belonged to the emperor, and it set up an equal field system like China, which required an occasional census. So, every 6-7 years or so, every 6 years actually, they took a census and they would say all the adult free males should receive about 1/3 of an acre, and the females about 1/5 of an acre. And this required a census. It levied taxes. It levied corvée labor, which is, forced labor. Back in the days before they had, construction crews and road crews and employees of the government, if you wanted a road built or a bridge built, you forced the people in that area to work on that, usually in the off-season, not in the planting and harvesting season. But some land remained as shoen or tax-free estates. Don't worry so much about that. We'll come back to it. The Fujiwara clan also brought about in 702 Taiho the Great Treasure Code, which inaugurated a criminal code and established a bureaucratic ranking system with different ministers. Now, just a couple more things we need to talk about, and that is Japan is going to move into a system of manorialism and its military equivalent, which we call feudalism. What happened in ancient medieval cultures is population would increase and the burden of taxation would fall on the poorer people, the peasant people. The upper classes usually were given tax exemptions. So what happened is if a population begins to increase, the peasants are becoming actually kind of poorer and poorer as time goes on. They don't have as much of land per person anymore. At one point in time, this whole equal field system is going to break down, and the peasant's standard of living is going to decline. They're not going to have as many crops to pay the taxes, as usually it was a percentage of the crops, as they would have had before. And so what happens is the whole central government begins to fall apart. The peasants can't afford to pay their taxes. The peasants go to the rich landowners near them and say, we can't afford to pay our taxes anymore. And the rich landowners say, okay, then we'll own your land. You come to work for us. And we don't pay any taxes, and we'll protect you. So a whole new system of manorialism, or what calls seniorialism, arises, where the wealthy, the rich, become lords of manors, and the peasants, in essence, become their serfs, tied to the land, working for them. And before long, all of these rich folks who are lords of the manor are going to have their own private armies. And that's when you have the military equivalent of manorialism, feudalism, develop. Eventually, always, this thing's going to fix itself. The merchant class will grow. Manorialism and feudalism will fall apart. A powerful ruler will emerge, and a central government will reappear. Now, there's one thing that I want to go over quickly because we mentioned it, and that is this whole idea of Confucianism coming from China. Confucianism believed in 5 crucial relationships. A relationship between a father and a son, ruler, subject, elder brother, younger brother, husband, wife, elder friend, junior friend. In each of these, you see the respect for age, and you also see that these are actually reciprocal relations. So a father is to teach his son a trade, a father is to teach his son about the ancestors, but a son is to respect his father, has duties to his father, but a father has duties to his son, like showing him a vocation, etc. And so I want you to keep this in mind, because remember how we talked about the importance of groups, the importance of family, that the priority here was not individualism. Confucianism falls right into that whole Japanese mindset. It's part of the entire Chinese, Japanese, Asian mindset. And the major work of Confucius was the Analects, or sayings of Confucius. And you've heard, obviously, some of them. Finally, one thing. So, the Nara period. The Yamato state moved the capital to Nara. It built a capital city based upon that of Tang Dynasty China in Xi'an. And it was during this period that we get that Kojiki and Nihon Shoki, which are the record of ancient matters in the Chronicle of Japan. We also get in liturgy a bunch of anthologies of poetry, like the Manyoshi, the collection of 10,000 leaves, written by a variety of people, emperors, but also commoners, warriors, but also even women. Well, the Emperor Shomu ruled from 724 to 49. By that time, peasants were about 95% of the population. They paid very heavy taxes, and to escape the heavy taxation, many peasants moved to the tax-exempt land owned by temples and owned by the rich. Some became vagrants, or roaming people called ronin. We don't know exactly why. Perhaps he didn't like all the powerful Buddhist temples in the city of Nara, but Emperor Kamu moved the capital in 784 to another place, Nagaoki, and finally to Heian, Kyoto in 794, ending the Nara period. But you can see what's happening here. You can see what's happening here economically, politically. We have now set the stage for the Heian period of next week. Any questions, feel free to email or phone me. I am always